Hello, everyone. I am here with the amazing writer and director Christian Swegal from the amazing film, which recently premiered at Tribeca Film Festival, Sovereign. Christian, I have to say this, I never have said this actually on any of my interviews, but this was my favorite film at the film festival this
Oh,
year
wow.
out of
Thank you.
Yes, out of all the films that I screened, this landed at number one. I honestly have already watched it a few times. So
Wow. Thank you.
I'm really excited to talk to you about the film and starting off with why you decided to take on this storyline. So Sovereign is based off of a true story. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about your involvement in knowing the story and why you decided to make it into this incredible film?
Yeah, thank you. The I've always been interested in kind of like fringe ideology subcultures in the United States, pretty much, or globally, really. I mean, things like QAnon or cults, or just how do people get involved in these movements? And there's such a knee-jerk reaction to kind of write those people off or just other them or say, well, how, there's something wrong with those people. And in a lot of cases there is, but it's usually a lot more complicated than we're first led to believe. And I just, when I heard about this crime, it felt like a great, uh, it just felt like a great starting point to talk about a lot of themes that I'm really interested in. And, whether it's gun culture or how we deal with mental health in this country, or, just the issue of fathers and sons and how we raise our sons. I'm a new dad myself. And, I think a lot about that. Like there's sort of this masculine urge to like imprint on your son, like a way of being in the world. And certainly my dad was like that. And I think just trying to look at something that's really complex and real that's happening in our country right now, and instead of making a judgment about it, look into the reasons behind it and the why, really, to see if there's a way to understand it in a more honest way.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways I feel like you could have taken this film, especially with so many political elements. And what I really enjoyed is that I left the film not feeling like I was siding with one or the other. How did you go about the direction of this and teetering on that fine line of, not telling the viewer what they should feel or what they should think, but kind of leaving it up to them and their perception?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was really the intention for us, and some people appreciate that, and some people are kind of like, well, what are you saying to me, and want something a little bit more prescriptive. But I think that was the challenge of this movie, was to take something that feels very political in the subject matter, but to try to tell a human story in an apolitical film. And I think with these issues, again, anything that even is in the world of anything political, we're immediately picking a side and then making a judgment. And I think that's why the world is so polarized right now. And a lot of the people that I interviewed and have known in these sort of movements, as misguided as their information is, in my opinion, um, their grievances are really valid a lot of times. Like when you hear their story, you say, well, oh, well, I understand why you don't trust the government necessarily then. Like, okay, so you lost your house, your town's been wiped out, you have you've had health issues that are unaddressed, you've been preyed upon by a system. And then kind of the official answers that they're given, they don't trust, because at the end of the day they just see, well, I'm poorer and this rich person is richer now. And I think a lot of people after 2008 especially felt like, okay, economy collapsed, I lost my house, I was given this sort of official line of like how to deal with something like that. But at the end of the day, like, I'm worse off, and these rich people that did this to me are better off. So there's this breakdown in a trust in systems. And and in official narratives. And I don't necessarily think that that's invalid. I think that hasn't been handled responsibly either. And so in that vacuum, people like Jerry Kane sort of step forward and say, I've got the answer. And, if you're in a desperate situation, you cling to that kind of hope and that guidance. And that's really dangerous. That's when a lot of bad ideas start spreading. And, but it's really coming from a very human place of trying to find community and validation. Um, and that was what I was interested in looking at, and how do these sort of like human instincts on both sides lead to these conflicts.
Well, and you humanize the characters so beautifully, and it was just so relatable. And even if it wasn't necessarily the same exact situation that maybe somebody's going through, I feel like there are things that everyone can kind of take from, even in my life, growing up with kind of a similar situation, but not exact with religion, and how sometimes, certain things can pull at you when you're so desperate and in
Yeah,
need of financial stability, essentially. And it's so crazy sometimes to think of what would somebody go through in order to survive. And I think that you just did such a lovely job of kind of peeling away those layers with these different, even though they're smaller characters
thank
in
you.
these sessions, but you really feel for them and understand, wow, if I were to be empathetic and put myself in their shoes, I may be doing exactly what they're doing. And, on the outer layer, someone might think that they're crazy, but the way that you really take us into the story, it's like I really understand both sides of the spectrum. So now I want to kind of jump
Thank you.
in to your stellar cast. My goodness. I still can't believe that this was Nick Offerman's first lead role. Is that correct?
I think it might have been his sort of first real. Yeah, I mean, he's certainly had leading moments in things, but in terms of headlining a film, I think this might be, yeah.
Which is crazy. I mean, The Last of Us, I think, sticks with all of us. And to see him, though, really just take the wheel in this character of Jerry Kane. I mean, this is a multidimensional character. He's so deep. And at times, I think I know him and I think I understand him. And then you throw, a ball left field at me, and I'm like, whoa, 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 what just happened here? Why did you pick Nick for the role of Jerry?
Well, I think he has a physicality that's really unique. I mean, it's fun. It's very difficult to find actors, in my opinion, at least, that have the ability to play sort of like a physical menace. Nick is a bigger guy, and he can look angry and he can look really scary, but at the same time, he has this beautiful paternal, loving side that we've seen in a lot of his films. So to play both of those things and to be able to swing sort of so rapidly between both of those is a really unique characteristic in an actor. And he's always been one of my favorite actors. I think he's an incredible artist and collaborator and leader on set. Really, he set the tone for our entire production. And but I think his ability to be dangerous and masculine and sort of imposing, but also have that warmth and paternal side and emotional dexterity is really hard to find in a performer. So that's what we were looking for with this.
He played each specific characteristic flawlessly, and then his chemistry with Jacob Tremblay was phenomenal to see. Jacob's character kind of reminds me of myself a little bit too. My parents worked all the time, so I spent a lot of time at home. And the first scene was so impactful to me, where he's just laying in the living room by himself. And it just like kind of took me back to my childhood
Yeah,
of like, whoa, I can really feel this. And there's no dialogue there, but he's able to emote so much without dialogue. Were you
yeah.
expecting that from him when you brought him on board for this project?
I mean, seeing his other performances, I was certainly, a huge fan and felt he could do it. It's like as you just said, it's a very internal performance. He doesn't have, Jerry, Nick's character is really the bombastic, extroverted, kind of Nick's character is really the bombastic sort of extroverted character. And Jake has to play, uh, everything is internal, everything is through looks and these sort of micro expressions. And that stuff is so incredibly difficult to direct. If you can imagine, you can't tell somebody in a prescriptive way, all right, well, shift your eyes this way and shift, they really have to just become that character and live in it. And Jacob really did that. I think that's the reason why we still feel so rooted in his perspective, is because he's so present, and that performance is so lived in, and it's so nuanced. Um, yeah, he's incredible, Jake. And honestly, it's all credit to him. I didn't, have to say anything special to him. He read the script, he understood it. We talked about the character, and then he would do his thing. And it was just, thrilling to watch, really, because you have this character in your mind, and you've written it and everything, and then to see an actor become that person and bring it to life in a way is just a huge gift as a filmmaker. It's awesome.
I think seeing him in Room, I mean, Room was one of my all-time favorite books to read growing up, and then seeing him in the actual character on a big screen was just so igniting. And I think that was such a great foundation actually for this role. So he was
Mm-hmm.
16 when he started filming this, which is crazy. I just can't even imagine at 16 being able to do what he does in front of the camera. But there are a lot of just great moments of Joe's character, which is very socially awkward because we find out that he's homeschooled at the start. His dad goes on these long trips where we don't even really know as the audience, like how long he's even left, Joe
Mm-hmm.
for. It could be months on end. We have no clue. But, he emotes this amazing awkwardness. And I think one of my favorite scenes actually was when he's in one of the sessions with his father and he's getting these new responsibilities to help him. And he asks everybody when he's handing out pamphlets, how many of you have gone to school?
Yeah.
And it's just like, and everybody raises their hand. And then he says, we all know then, to take one and pass it along. But like it was such a simple dialogue, but in that moment, that's when it hit me like, wow, he's really out of touch kind of with that interpersonal kind of communication with
Yeah.
how should I talk to people? How do I interact with them?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where, it's interesting, like how are you directing him in those moments in the
Well,
script?
yeah, I mean, I think that moment really speaks to, he's a character who's kind of mimicking how to be normal in the world, when he says, who all here has been to school, and then everybody
Hmm.
raises their hand. That's kind of it's he's trying to play along with, like, that thing of take one and pass it back is something you
Yeah.
hear in school. He
Uh-huh.
certainly didn't hear it in school. So
Exactly.
he heard that somewhere, and he's trying to kind of mimic, being in the real in the normal world. But he's a kid who, his entire world is so small. And
Hmm.
one of the things I talked a lot about with Jake was just that when you grow up that sheltered, and your information is that controlled, and your world is literally like your living room and your dog and a TV,
Hmm.
um, you don't develop at the same rate, I think, as everybody else. I've known some some kids who grew up like that, and you know at 17 or 18 years old, they sometimes have the taste of like a 12 or 13-year old. They're stunted in a lot of ways, and I think socially, is certainly one of them. And so one thing I did talk to Jake about a lot was, like, you know try to remember what it was like to be maybe more like 12 or 13, and how you would have approached some of these situations. And so I think he was playing even a little bit younger, as part of his performance, which, I think I think makes it kind of more heartbreaking in a way.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's not at all a comment on homeschooling or anything. I think there's a lot of wonderful benefits probably to that, and I know some friends that do that. But for this character specifically, it was we were trying to say something about how isolated he was.
And there's also some lights at the end of the tunnel, I feel like, that you kind of dabble throughout. So we've got a smaller character, his neighbor, who clearly it comes off as he's got a bit of a crush. He's very aware of her and just in hopes that she'll kind of notice him, reach back out to him. There's that Facebook moment of him kind of just like a normal adolescent kid, just looking up somebody that, you have some intrigue into. Uh, but also other characters that, evolve around him too, that have a motherly figure, where you've got Martha Plimpton's character, Leslie Ann, bringing a motherly kind of finesse. I feel
Hmm.
like the character development with all these, more minor characters really just show a more kind of broad aspect of his acting ability too. But
Hmm.
also, I mean, Leslie Ann's character, though small, very a big component of this motherly, nurturing kind of feeling.
Hmm.
What was your kind of plan in inserting her into the storyline?
Well, I think that it's very easy to look at a character like a Jerry Kane, and certainly this isn't a comment on who he was, the real person, but at least the version of him in our film. I think it's easy to sort of turn him into a monster and make him one note. But there's also the question of like, well, why are people showing up to these seminars? Why are people listening to him? What's good about him? And I thought that just at a time where you see Jake's character start to be pulled away from his father by, he got to spend some time in the juvenile home. He's talking to some normal other adults who are like, hey, you deserve to be a kid. The Leslie Ann character kind of comes back in and then sort of reconfirms Jerry's perspective on the world. And I think it's a way to pull Jake back in the other direction again, just where he was sort of starting to kind of escape. And and also, but not do it in a totally sinister way, to do it in a way of like, well, what is good about this guy? And I think one of the I talked to certainly Nick Offerman about this. One of the things about his character that is appealing to people is you have a lot of people who are disempowered. You have a lot of people who feel like really desperate and down on their luck. And he comes along and he has a lot of courage. It's misguided courage, but he has sort of a rallying cry for them of don't take this. You can fight back. There's ways to fight. I'm going to show you how to do it. She has this kind of phobia about horses that's kind of funny on the
Yeah.
surface, but like he helps her break through that moment and shows that like, hey, don't be scared. This is about conquering. and,
Hmm.
and that empowerment and validation is really important. I mean, people love that, when you feel like you're getting beaten up and somebody comes along and says, hey, believe in yourself, you can do this. That's a really appealing message, and it shows why people are paying for those seminars. And one of the, even though misguided, like positive qualities that he has, every character, even though he's the villain in this movie, that's one side of his personality. I'm sure that even the worst people in the world, if you talk to the people that were closest to them, they probably had a good side. Maybe they were funny, maybe they were whatever. I don't think it's sacrilegious to also show those aspects if you're trying to do something, kind of honest. So that was the point of that character.
Yeah, I mean, his messaging too, I felt like it was always reiterating, you, the people, have the power. And it was
Yeah.
constant, that
Yeah.
constant messaging that you thought you forgot. And then he reminded us, oh, you, the people, have the power. And with
Yeah.
her, there's this one scene that I love so much. It was just, you do such great, close, tight shots. And one of them is just a very simple shot. The three of them are sitting in the car, Joe, Jerry, Joe's in the back, and they're just holding hands.
Yeah.
And
Thanks.
that alone speaks so much, and Joe kind of like seeing that and clearly is in need of a motherly figure, not having, his own.
Yeah.
But those close-up shots, were those intentional? Is that kind of what you were hoping to resonate with your audience?
Yeah, I think this, we tried to the visual, I think the entire filmmaking team really tried to present this story as sort of simply uh simply and as elegantly and as straightforward as possible. And I think it's really basic, but showing people holding hands is a way of showing, after they have that kind of breakthrough moment in the movie, just to see that they're holding hands afterwards shows that they're bonded and feeling close to each other in a way that you don't really need to have a whole scene about, of them gushing to each other. Like you can just show something really simple like that. And I think in any way that we could sort of strip things down and just show things in a very kind of simple way, we tried to with this film.
It was very well done. Now I want to get into Dennis Quaid, who is an incredible actor. He's one of those actors that even if his role is super small, you just really remember his lines, you remember his character. I mean, Substance was one of those last films where I was just like, wow, I forgot how amazing of an actor he was. And Dennis Quaid's character, Chief Bouchard, is kind of completely opposite, but also kind of similar in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
He's more of law abiding, where Jerry's character is complete opposite, and then his son Adam also is a little different as well. So it's interesting how these two kind of plot lines align and intersect too. How did you separate the two differently, and how did you direct, I guess, the two subsets differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Dennis's character and Nick's character are really polar opposites in terms of how they see the world and how they approach everything. But they have the same, they have that same fatherly, masculine drive of trying to shape their sons and sort of mold their sons in their image. And um, Dennis, it's funny with Dennis, he's really a movie star, he's one of those old school movie stars, and he shows up and brings there, that we talked about the character, he read the script, he knew the perspective that I had on the character, but his choices are very, I think because he's just so seasoned, there wasn't a lot of, it wasn't an iterative process. He didn't have to try 10 versions. He sort of just knew how he wanted to play it. I agreed with it. He did his thing and it was great. It was really a wonderful collaboration because he he was really supportive. Being a first time filmmaker, he could have been really difficult or challenged me on every single thing, but I think he understood the intention of the story and really agreed with it. And then the choices that he made in each scene, I think were just really honest and accurate. He had a very clear perspective on the character he wanted to play, and it was a pretty direct process, to be honest.
Well, Christian, I could talk to you about this film for hours on end, but my time unfortunately is up. I just want to congratulate you again and
Thank
thank you so
you.
much for bringing this story to life so wonderfully. I can't wait to tell everyone about Sovereign again. Impeccable job on the writing end, directing end, and just spectacular cast.
Thank you very much. It was great talking to you.